Welcome to Minerva Meets. I'm your host, Sonal Chandler, and this is episode 6. Today, we're going to be talking about an approach to managing cybersecurity called governance, risk, and compliance. And with me today, I have Cathy Myron. Cathy is a data backup and cybersecurity expert and CEO of eSilo. For over 15 years, Cathy has helped businesses protect their reputation and get back on their feet after cyber attacks and IT system failures. Cathy and the entire eSilo team help clients avoid data loss and downtime by implementing practical, actionable strategies to disaster-proof their businesses. Outside of eSilo, Cathy is a speaker, trainer, and certified small business mentor. She also serves as a board member and advisory committee member for nonprofit organizations committed to improving access to tech and education in South Florida. Welcome to the show, Cathy.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have to tell you this, this is almost a celebration because you are my first female guest on the show. And I'm so excited because to date, I've had male guests who have been wonderful, but I'm really excited to have a female guest on my show today.
I always love being a first. So thank you for inviting me. This is great.
Great. All right, well, let's dive in. So you and I are familiar with what GRC is, but why don't we tell our listeners a little bit about what we mean by GRC?
Sure. So GRC stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And as I think about what organizations need in terms of overseeing and managing their IT, this is one of the areas that tends to get overlooked, at least in the beginning. Governance is all about how you manage and really how the board and senior management team oversee the IT and cybersecurity functions. This is oversight, this is budgeting, this is about how decisions get made, how vendors get selected, putting together a strategic roadmap and what should we be aiming to do to transform the business in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, right? That's really this broad umbrella that we call governance. From a risk standpoint, this is all about understanding what are the threats, whether they're internal or external to the business, that we need to understand, quantify, evaluate, and then decide if and how we're going to respond. So if you think about risk, generally speaking, people are familiar with financial risk or enterprise risk or operational risk. In the technology sense, this is absolutely inclusive of cybersecurity risk, but also other things like technical debt, just key man dependencies, right? There's a whole range of risks that are technology oriented, not to mention how we protect and secure our data and our information, right? Which is very top of mind these days. And then the compliance element is all about how do we understand what regulatory frameworks or laws or even, I put this under the compliance bucket, but best practices, right? Industry standards around how technology is run and managed and secured. How do we ensure that the organization is meeting those requirements, whether they're externally imposed or internally driven? So GRC professionals, it's a whole career path. In large enterprises, it's an entire function or subset of the technology function. But in smaller companies and startups and companies looking to scale, it's more often than not one person, or sometimes even outsourced or a portion of a person's job, which is sort of where we tend to come in and how we work with clients.
Gotcha. And I'm glad that you touched on the career path piece. We'll come back to that because I think it's important to at least let our listeners know how they can kind of get into this line of work if they were interested in doing that. But before we go to that in that direction, let's dive into a little bit more detail about each of these different components. So let's start with governance and, what is really the role of governance in technology and business strategy and having those two components aligned along with governance.
Yeah. So in its simplest terms, the way that you can think about it is how do we ensure that the IT function or the technology decisions that get made in an organization ultimately support the business strategy and the business outcomes and goals? There's a lot of times where you can have, great investments in technology to keep the lights on, but they don't help further the mission. So IT governance is all about understanding where we make those investments, where we allocate budget, where we decide on growing the team and having technology hires, how they support the broader mission, and how does senior management ensure that the function is doing what it should be doing? It's performing well. They're looking at the right metrics. There's the right utilization, right? So that we don't have a bloated function that costs us a lot of money and provide a lot of competitive advantage or benefit. And that aspect too of having a competitive advantage with technology. I mean, I think if we all kind of step back and look at what has happened over the last couple of years, especially following COVID, there's been huge advancements and recognition that technology is an absolute game changer for every single industry.
Yeah.
But traditionally, IT, and I hate that label, that's why I try to replace it with technology, has been, it's the back office, boring function.
The last to know.
Yeah. And we want to spend as little as possible, or, the adage always used to be like, do more with less. So we would cut your budget by 10%, but support the same number of people. And unfortunately, that doesn't recognize the potential that technology has to impact those, business top line growth, right? And those outcomes. And also, it just doesn't inspire innovation. It doesn't inspire new thought and new ideas. And so I think a really effective governance function looks at the business holistically and says, where can technology play a role to keep the lights on, but also spring us forward?
Sure.
And provide, disruptive advantage or even just competitive advantage over others in the marketplace.
And completely agree with you. What different types of teams or individuals within an organization typically would make up a governance team?
So I usually, the team is really small. So maybe if I can answer your question in terms of tactical functions, like what happens, like what does the governance team do? I would say first and foremost, they're the ones who are responsible for the policies of the organization, right? So that's a very traditional governance role, is we define the policy of what we can and can't do, how the function and really the business needs to operate as it pertains to technology. So that's one. Also in that bucket, I put the budget. Now, usually in a larger organization, the CIO or the CTO, or perhaps if there is none of those roles, the COO is helping to define the overall technology budget. But really, this is how we ensure that the budget gets allocated to the right things, and that there is a level of cost control and oversight to how projects are being run, if they're finishing on time, if they're finishing on budget, right? That's another element that falls under technology governance. The third thing this is governance, but not done by a person on the technology team, but really governance at the board level, is that the board needs to be seeing metrics and dashboards that show them how the technology function and really also the cyber function is operating. At the end of the day, the board is responsible for cybersecurity, but they can only effectively do their job if they're provided the right amount of data. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen in very large companies, so, Fortune 10, but also in smaller companies, where the level of information that the board is given is really minimal, if at all. So they get it's a one-page PowerPoint dashboard that's probably mostly green that says, hey, we're doing everything that we should be doing, right? And those are often still the same organizations that end up having issues. And so I guess the reason I bring this up is to say that as consultants, there's a role that we have in educating the board on what they should be given, right? What information is reasonable to ask for, and also how to ask those probing questions so that they can effectively uncover when we might be underinvesting or measuring the wrong things. Vanity metrics is always a big issue in governance, right? I did my job, so it's green, but maybe the business didn't actually mitigate the risk, right? Because
I'm so glad you brought up education and educating the board, because I think that oftentimes this topic, it's it becomes overwhelming, right? Because not many people really understand, security and the risks that are related around it. So educating the board is so important. Not only the board, but your entire staff, right? Like making sure that people are all understanding what we mean by the threats, the risks, everything that surrounds cybersecurity.
And the last thing I'll add is that
Mhm.
typically we'll see a governance committee, or maybe it gets called a IT steering committee, but
Yeah.
there's often, as you know, a cross-functional group of stakeholders who have a vested interest in what the technology function does, where those resources get allocated. So
Hmm.
typically you'll find that whoever's in charge of IT, right? So the CIO,
Hmm.
the COO, the CFO, or delegates from their staff, but usually you want to keep it at an executive level, as well as maybe business line heads or product line heads
Hmm.
participate in an overall steering committee, so that they understand when we start talking about bigger projects that might transform the way that work gets done, or roll out some new customer facing product or service or website,
Hmm.
that there's engagement and participation from those other functions, and buy-in, frankly, to the change that those projects will create, so that ultimately the organization is all headed in the right direction. Everybody's in agreement and understands, if we're going to go spend $100 million on this new ERP system, or in a small
Hmm.
business context, even if it's 500K on some big transformative initiative, that everybody understands where, why, how, and can oversee that progress over the course of the months or years that it
Yeah.
takes to complete.
Yeah. And then continuously measuring, right, to ensure that they're still on track and following the original goal of whatever the initiative is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, why don't we dive into risk? Let's talk a little bit more about risk and how does a business manage and assess risk?
Yeah. So this is probably where I should give the disclaimer that I spent 9 years as an internal auditor. So I
Oh,
have a very audit based mindset
sure.
around risk, right?
Yep.
But in its simplest form, you think about it as, likelihood of a bad thing happening times the impact of what would happen to the business if that thing actually came to fruition. And
Hmm.
that is how you quantify risk.
Hmm.
I do a lot of work with small businesses on helping them begin to put dollars and numbers around their cybersecurity risk, because it's one of these very abstract things. Like, I know
Yeah.
it's a threat, it might happen to me, but I don't really know how to quantify the impact, and therefore decide what should be my budget to
Hmm.
allocate towards cybersecurity projects, or things like that. So when you break it down in terms of likelihood, and especially if you're a smaller business, you can look at studies by a whole bunch of different groups, cybersecurity researchers. If you're interested in data breach stats in particular, I would recommend the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. It's published every year. It's like 100 pages of very in-depth material on where attacks are happening, how they're happening, what tactics are being used, what industries are being hit. It's a great source of information. So you can look at a publication like that and
Hmm.
begin to put some percentages and probabilities to your likelihood of experiencing an attack, and frankly, having that attack be successful based on the maturity or lack thereof of your
Right.
controls.
Sure.
Right. And then on the impact side, I always encourage companies to think about, what would an hour, a day, a week of downtime mean to your business, both in terms of lost revenue, but also lost productivity, erosion of customer trust, the fact that you're still going to be paying salaries and rent and whatever overhead you have, even if your business is inoperable for an
Hmm.
extended period of time. But when you can boil it down to a cost of downtime per hour, and can
Yeah.
estimate, on average, based on other people's experiences and the maturity of our own disaster recovery and business
Yeah.
continuity capabilities, we think that if we had a massive ransomware attack, we would be down for a week, or in the case of Change Healthcare, several weeks, right?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
you can do the math, and then, all right, so we have a 50% likelihood
Hmm.
of this bad thing happening. It's going to cost us this amount of money. What portion of that impact is management willing to spend this year, next year, every year thereafter,
Hmm.
on cybersecurity and ransomware prevention measures? And that might come in the form of tools or process or training or, additional people to staff up the security team. But that's the very tangible way that I think about risk.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's really abstract, right? Like, oh, I
Yeah.
have a high risk of this, low risk of that. But what does that actually mean? And how does a business leader make decisions based
Yeah.
on that data?
Yeah, and I really like how you talked about the small business because I think that large corporations have the tools and the resources, or they know how to go and get the tools and resources to help them mitigate risk. But I think that smaller businesses are the ones that are more vulnerable to this. And, there's also an education piece here. Because I think oftentimes the thought is, well, it's not going to happen to me, and then it becomes a reactive risk mitigation versus proactive risk mitigation, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I also just want to mention that those reports that you mentioned, we'll put links in that in the show notes so that if people wanted to go to it, they can click on those links. Let's talk about compliance. How does regulatory compliance really work?
Yeah. It's every industry is going to be a little bit different.
Hmm.
So having come from a Fortune 10 company where we were a multinational conglomerate, I've had at least some exposure to a variety of different industry regulations, whether that's financial services. I spent 4 years in the depths of GE Capital, and we had a lot of banks both in the US and internationally. So a lot of different banking regs that tend to vary
Hmm.
by country. But then I've also been in healthcare with HIPAA, or other areas for energy and aviation and things like that. What I would tell you as it pertains to cybersecurity in particular, because that's my area of expertise and really where my passion lies,
Hmm.
all of the regulations are all different in their own way. But if you strip them back, what they're asking for, like what comprises good and safe IT systems and deployments, is very similar across the board. So, folks that work in this space will have often a massive control matrix. So we maintain a matrix of HIPAA regulations versus FTC safeguards
Sure.
versus the Federal Reserve, the FFIEC handbook. And you can map similar requirements across those compliance frameworks. So
Right.
really think about it in terms of it's a compliance framework.
Hmm.
Most companies, even when they're small, will have to comply or adhere to one or more of those frameworks. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, but my business model is very simple. How could I possibly, get caught up in multiple
Right.
frameworks? The simple thing I would tell you is if you are doing something in the healthcare space and you have protected health information, as an example, you would be
Yeah.
subject to HIPAA. But if you're taking credit card payments in any way, shape, or form, you're also subject to PCI, so payment card industry requirements.
Hmm.
And really, every business out there, even if you're not formally regulated or licensed, or there's a set of laws that particularly apply to your industry, there is something called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST.
Hmm.
They have a very well regarded, well known framework for cybersecurity health, is I guess what I'll call it. It's not a
Yeah.
regulation, called NIST CSF. And you think about it as like the golden standard, the golden rule for cybersecurity if you don't fall subject to a specific regulation.
Hmm.
And all of the publications are out there on the internet. You can go and read the NIST standard. You can, and actually we do this, we perform NIST CSF assessments for businesses who are trying to get a feel for how is my cybersecurity health?
Yeah.
Where do I have major gaps? And those areas will typically cover governance, your ability to identify all of the assets and data that you need to protect, your ability to detect if something is happening to them, how you then protect those assets and that data, how you respond to cyber events, and ultimately how you recover from an event. So there's a 6-step framework.
Hmm.
And it's a really good guideline for anybody who's just starting out on their cybersecurity
Yeah.
journey, because even if you're not formally required to comply with regulation X, Y, and Z, this is best practice stuff. This is stuff that your customers are expecting you to do.
Yeah.
Um, if you want cyber insurance, your insurance company is going to expect that you have. And frankly, that you as a business leader should be proactively implementing in your organization so that you have at least some standards that you abide by.
Yeah. And when we talk about compliance, I think sometimes we forget to talk about the impact of not complying. And
Mhm.
there's a cost associated to that. Do you have any thoughts on some of that? Because I've often run into, excuse me, situations where, clients will say, oh, well, I'll just take the fine.
Mhm.
Right. And so, how do you determine, okay, should I take the fine or is it better to comply?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. See, in my mind, it should never be an option
Right.
because regardless of whether or not there is active enforcement in that area and there's, precedent for significant fines,
Hmm.
where I think that you have greatest damage or potential for damage is in your brand reputation
Yep.
and in your customer relationships.
Yeah.
So I don't ever want to do business with a company that is sloppy with my data, that doesn't meet industry accepted baselines for cybersecurity practices. And I think most other savvy customers, whether those are B2B customers or if you're dealing with consumers,
Hmm.
feel the same way. And there have been studies on sort of trust and what consumer attitudes have been to companies that breach their trust and have these issues. So what I would tell you is that you need to think more holistically than just direct dollars out of pocket.
Hmm.
And I'll just give you some examples.
Yeah.
If you've experienced a breach, right, it's less about compliance and like, does some regulator come and slap me on the wrist? You're potentially incurring a cost of $175 per record lost. So if
Yes.
you have thousands of records on consumers or customers that you've dealt with before, and even employees and vendors, right? Think about personal information,
Hmm.
that can be very costly, as is the cost for insurance renewals. So
Yeah.
next time you go to renew your insurance, you do have to disclose if you've experienced any data related breaches or issues, or even in some cases, you have to disclose attempted
Hmm.
break-ins and thefts of data. That'll also affect your insurance premiums, not to
Yep.
mention overall reputation and things like that we already sort of talked about. So the thing that I would just say though, because I think there's this misconception, if I do everything that the law requires, or if I follow and I'm 100% in compliance, I won't be breached or I won't ever experience an issue in my company. And that's not true.
Right.
You can
Yeah, I
be
agree.
compliant and still unsecure, and you
Yes.
can be secure and completely non-compliant. And
Yes.
so you really
Yes.
need you really need a team that understands both.
Yeah.
And back to risk and risk management and governance, how decisions get made. If you have a limited budget, which we all do,
Hmm.
uh, where you prioritize those dollars to get the most bang for your buck, where you can both reduce your risk of a security incident while also complying with the regulations and requirements for your industry. And if you think about it like a Venn diagram, a lot of things
Hmm.
overlap, but there's also a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I definitely appreciate that. Um, as a small business, let's just focus on the smaller guys. How how do I navigate all of this, right? There's, like you mentioned earlier, there's so many different frameworks. How do I know which one applies to me? And, sometimes I've actually even heard people say, I don't even understand what these are asking me to do, right? So how do I navigate all of this?
So the best thing that I would say is make sure that you have a trusted advisor who understands this space.
Yeah.
They don't have to be a deep expert in cybersecurity just to help you and your leadership team get your bearings on what are the applicable laws, regulations, and standards that I should comply with. What are the things that we want to comply with voluntarily or we want to adopt as frameworks because we think that's going to open some strategic doors for us.
Hmm.
And for example, what I mean by that is we've had customers who are 10 $15 million companies, but they're trying to sell to the Fortune 1000. And in order to even be on an approved vendor list, they have to pass a 4-page security questionnaire and
Yes.
describe their controls and describe how they handle the customer's information. If you're not in a position to be able to attest to the fact that you have these things in place, you're never going to get that business. So there's a strategic element to this too. So what do I want to voluntarily comply with or adopt as standards? And then what I would tell you to do is get an assessment, right? Have somebody, and it doesn't have to be extremely lengthy or costly, but once a year, have somebody come in and do an assessment of your cybersecurity health. And usually that's going to be a combination of a couple things. I'm a big believer in the whole three-legged stool concept of people, process, and tools. This isn't just a scanning of your website or even an external penetration test of your office or network or systems. It should also be a review of your procedures, how you train your staff, what your policies are, how you handle people onboarding, offboarding, job changes.
Are they trained even, right?
Exactly. Training is a huge component of that. How data moves between systems and processes, right? Often it's the systems, yes, can talk to each other, but a lot of times it's pulled into a spreadsheet and then it's emailed to so-and-so, right? So the messiness of, the reality for how data moves, that all sits in the hands of your staff and your people. So how well they're trained, how well they're given the tools to handle that properly, can be a lot of where your risk lies that you're not even really thinking about. So those are some of the things that I would say that this is where you start, is have a trusted advisor who helps you get the lay of the land and understand what you're shooting for, and then get yourself an assessment or a health check, so that you have a baseline that you can then use to close gaps. So in eSilo, we call it an issue log and a management action plan, a map. We give management a map that says, okay, these are the gaps that you have. Our recommendation for where you are in your business maturity, your life cycle, for the environment in your industry, what's that appetite of management to really close all these gaps right away. Like, these are the things that we think you should do in the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. And it's a maturity program. It's not something that you need to go and do overnight. It's all risk-based decisions around, where am I least comfortable? Let me go and spend some money and some time closing the gaps in the areas where I'm least comfortable or feel like has the greatest impact. And then next year we'll revisit, reassess, and do it again. And that's how you continually improve.
Absolutely. And I completely agree on getting a baseline. And oftentimes I've had clients who, they might score poorly on their first go through an assessment. And I always tell them that's okay, right? Because now you know what your security posture is. You now know that there are some, vulnerabilities in your organization. Now let's go fix them, right? Let's prioritize, and you don't have to boil the ocean. And I think I had mentioned this in a prior episode. Getting started doesn't mean that you've got to implement the high-class systems, or there's basic things that you can do to help start improving that score. And then, as you mentioned, just slowly maturing, because technology is changing. It's constantly changing. So it's important to continue to get assessed, continue to understand where you stand with your security posture.
And two things actually that I'll add to that, and why it's important to have somebody like you working with the business leaders, is if you're going to go ahead and do an assessment, right? There, you have to recognize that there is now the potential that once management has uncovered that they have certain gaps, there's the expectation that you need to fix them within a reasonable amount of time. And we can all, argue as to what we think is reasonable or not. So to protect the company and mitigate risk overall, I would suggest that if you think you have some glaring holes or some significant risks out there, you may want to have your legal counsel be the one that engages in the cybersecurity assessment, that hires the company that's going to do the health check or the assessment for you, so that that can be protected by attorney-client privilege, and you can effectively manage those results. Because the last thing that you want to have happen is 6 months from now, you have a breach, you have not had time to
Yeah.
close all the gaps and fix all the holes. And then somebody's suing you because you lost their data and they're pointing to this document, which is they're finding through discovery and saying
Right.
you knew about this, but you didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So in the industry, we're all sort of struggling with this to say the expectations are rising significantly, and they should be, right? We've had way too
Yeah.
many breaches.
Yeah.
So the expectations absolutely should rise, but a lot of companies are struggling to figure out how to address the multitude of gaps in a quick, time
Yeah.
frame. And so some
Absolutely.
of these things take time.
Yeah.
And that's one way to protect yourself.
And especially like smaller organizations who don't have enough staff or budget, right? They're going to have to space these projects out, and they often aren't going to get done in that year. And it's how quickly can they either partner with an external firm to help close some of those gaps, or take them on internally.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be incredibly expensive either. Because I know as
Yeah.
soon as people hear lawyers, they go, oh my God.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing I was going to actually point out is that if you do happen to have your attorney involved, ensure that they understand the cyber world, right? Like
Yes.
having somebody navigating that who isn't well versed, it's just more money out of your pocket, right? And then you
100%.
finally realize that you need somebody that understands this space.
And if you work with a good tech attorney, they're very used to this construct.
Yeah.
So we've had, clients have situations where they don't have in-house counsel, or even, their
Hmm.
outside counsel, maybe they use for contracts, but nothing related to cyber.
Yeah.
So there are attorneys who you can hire for, I don't know, less than $1,000 to help put the structure in place.
Yeah.
And they'll even tell you that they don't need to be in on every meeting, billing,
Yeah.
reviewing every document. Really, they want to know when the cybersecurity company has reached their conclusion and finished their audit. They want to know what
Hmm.
the findings are, and they want to sit in and advise management on how to handle those risks. And these are the ones that you absolutely need to do as top priority, because these are laws and regulations versus things that might be more best practice or just good to do.
Yeah.
So they will advise you. That's part of the value they bring, right? That's why you want
Yeah.
them in the conversation. They
Exactly.
don't need to be in everything. They just really need to be there in the very beginning, at the very end.
Yeah. That's great
So it's
advice.
not a lot of added cost.
Right, right. Well, let's transition a little and talk about some future trends in, cybersecurity and GRC. What are you seeing out there?
So healthcare is on my mind, partly because I have a big client right now in the healthcare space.
Hmm.
And I know you also have a background in healthcare
Yeah.
too.
Hmm.
Where the ripple effects from the Change ransomware attack that happened at the end of February
Yeah.
is going to shake things up in a massive way. So
Yeah.
for anyone who's listening and maybe isn't familiar,
Thank you.
back
Yes.
back on, I want to say it's February 21st, Change Healthcare, which is a division of United Healthcare. They were acquired by United a couple of years earlier for something like $13 billion. I mean, this is not a small company,
Yeah.
but they were acquired. They help with processing of payments for providers, so your local doctor and hospitals and things like that. They will handle prescriptions. They will handle billing for different procedures and things like that. So it's very much a billing platform. And I'm certainly not the expert on Change, but just as a
Mhm.
little background for kind of who they are and why this matters. They had experienced a ransomware attack. Actually, the initial break into their systems, as it's been reported in the news, happened because there was a old web portal, or remote
Mhm.
access system that was accessible from the internet. The bad guys, the Black Cat Alpha ransomware gang, had acquired a set of user credentials to that
Mm.
portal and ultimately used it to gain remote access into the Change Healthcare network. And then once they're in the network, you can move around laterally and discover what other systems are here, what data can I get to, right? That's how these
Yep.
attacks typically unfold. And unfortunately, that portal was not using that level of remote access, was not using multi-factor authentication.
Oh no.
So anybody who knows MFA, or
Yeah.
sometimes it's called like two-step verification, it's one of the most basic access controls Studies have shown, I think Microsoft did a study a couple of years ago, that 99.99% of automated attacks can be stopped with properly implemented MFA.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, this portal didn't have MFA enabled or enforced. So just acquiring those stolen credentials allowed the attackers to get into Change Healthcare's network. What proceeded to happen was, I guess, 9 days or so later, they did unleash the ransomware. So by that time, in the 9 days that transpired, they're doing reconnaissance,
Yeah.
they're exfiltrating data, or essentially downloading and stealing data.
Yeah.
And then ultimately they deployed the ransomware, which locked all of the machines and made them inaccessible, unusable, that all of your data is essentially scrambled and encrypted. You can't use or access anything unless you get the decryption key. And
Yeah.
so the way that all works is you got to go pay the bad guys to give
Yeah.
you the decryption key. You hope they give it to you. You hope they didn't also corrupt your data in the process.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, more recently, the ransomware gangs will also do a double extortion attack, which basically means we scramble your data so you can't access it and you want to pay. But let's just say you had a really good set of backups, right? So you could recover your systems without needing to pay us. Well, in order to incentivize you to pay us in that scenario, we're going to threaten to leak your data publicly. So more to prevent the embarrassment and also the fines and all of the impact that happens when that data gets leaked. That's the other thing, is we're going to threaten to extort you. So long story short, it was reported that they paid $22 million on the blockchain to get their data back. And unfortunately, then afterwards, other ransomware gangs did then threaten them again. So I guess the data had been, leaked elsewhere or maybe purchased by another gang. So lo and behold, the last I saw was they were getting additional demands for more money from different groups of bad actors. But the main issue being, for at a minimum of 3 weeks, but the disruption, lasted even longer than that.
Yeah.
Providers weren't getting paid. People couldn't fill prescriptions. And the CEO, I think it was, of United Healthcare, was testifying in front of Congress earlier, it was either this week or last week. They said, they were alluding to the fact that a significant portion of Americans' data was ultimately accessed in this attack. So when you think about widespread issues, like, this is it. And HIPAA regulations have been around since the late 90s. They're very, in my opinion, arcane. They were written before cloud, before AI, so they're pretty strict, I guess is the way I'll say it, very carefully worded. So there's a lot of, back to, you can be secure and not compliant, or you can be compliant and not secure. Compliance with HIPAA is, in my mind, very form over function. Like, there's a lot of form-based requirements. The policy has to be worded and written in a particular way. And I think that in some cases, when you talk about compliance, emphasis on form over substance, or in addition to substance, can sometimes drive the wrong behaviors. So you have a lot of small providers, and Change Healthcare wasn't a small provider, who claimed to be HIPAA compliant and yet still massively vulnerable to these types of attacks. So I think this is a huge wake-up call for the healthcare industry. I think that you'll see changes come. I don't know what those changes will be. They're probably needed changes to help smaller providers and smaller organizations comply, but also be secure and allocate their investments in the right places that are going to actually make a difference in protecting patient data and patient health.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because first of all, it's just the awareness, right, to our audience, and thank you for providing that background on Change Healthcare, but also just this need to have continuous review of the compliance framework, right, and ensuring that they're also moving with the times. And obviously we don't have control over those, but I think it's events like this that happen that cause that, and unfortunately cause that review to happen. What else? What other trends are you seeing?
So this wouldn't be a trend discussion without mention of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I do think that AI is great for many things, all the cool
Sure.
use cases and sales and marketing material and productivity assistant and maybe level one support for, IT companies or
Hmm.
anyone who's looking to better get scale out of, I'll say, mundane tasks and
Yeah.
activities. But in the world of cybersecurity, AI is also making it that much easier for bad actors to create convincing phishing
Yep.
emails, convincing deep fakes, right? You
Yeah.
hear, I don't know if you heard the story of there was a finance person based in Hong Kong. It was the Hong Kong branch of a global company. And he got a phishing email that was purportedly from the UK CFO saying there was essentially this secret transaction and I need you to wire $25 million. And
Yes, I
he was like,
did.
this feels a little fishy. I'm not going to do it. But then proceeded to join a video call where it appeared that CFO plus a room full of colleagues that he recognized were then reaffirming the instructions. And so ultimately, because of that video call and everyone appeared to be people he knew, he went
Yeah.
ahead and wired the money. And then lo and behold, we're talking about it now because it really was a really convincing deep fake phishing scam.
Yeah.
Um, so, stuff like that's going to continue to happen more and more. Um,
Hmm.
now, AI is being used by the good guys to improve the tools and the detection of these things, but you know how it is it's a little bit of cat and mouse, and it's
Yeah.
really hard to keep up with, especially state-sponsored actors, or
Hmm.
folks who run these professional ransom gangs and fraudsters. I mean, they do this for a living. They're very
Yeah.
organized.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
It's like a company. It's not just, it's no longer a kid sitting in his basement, with
Right.
too much time on his hands, but these are very sophisticated groups.
Yeah.
That's gonna be really interesting to watch. I've already heard about some things that changes that are happening in the real world in response to these types of attacks. So, as an
Okay.
example, certain banks are now requiring, if you have a large dollar money movement transaction, they require you to come in person because
Oh,
they can't
wow.
trust that the voice deep fakes and/or video deep fakes, like, who am I really speaking to, the person I'm speaking to?
Yeah.
So we're all going back to the days of
Yeah.
going to the branch and having a personal relationship with our banker so they
Yeah.
actually know who we are,
Yeah.
which I personally hate, but
I know.
I
I know.
understand.
But I appreciate, right? Because I mean, the last thing you want is your money going somewhere and trying to just recover all of that is just such a
Yeah,
hard thing to do, right?
yes. But
Yeah.
like, this is a perfect example of, in organizations, we're going to buy a tool and then sort of forget about it. And,
Yeah.
oh, the bar we're trying to meet is this compliance bar, as opposed to thinking about how the cyber adversaries are evolving
Yeah.
and therefore needing to make continual investments. This goes all the way back to, governance and budgeting,
Hmm.
continual investments to do what we can to stay one step ahead.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this element of watching what happens is really important if you're in a business that has really sensitive information and you can't afford a mistake.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree with you. Well, I know that we're almost at the end of our time here. And so I wanted to wrap it up and provide our listeners with a few key takeaways. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to give us a couple of takeaways that, if there's anything that our listeners got out of today's session, then, here's what they need to know.
Yeah. So thank you for that. What I think every business owner needs to know is that they're vulnerable and their company is vulnerable in ways that they may not even realize.
Hmm.
That might be through the systems that you use or the vendors that you trust or the people and processes that are running your business day to day. There can be faults and risks hidden in those procedures and in those tools. So we believe everybody should have this cybersecurity health assessment, some external view as to where are those gaps so that you can make an informed decision. And the
Yeah.
decision might be that we don't have the budget for it this year, or we don't have the time for it this year. Hopefully not. But you kind of don't know what you're dealing with until you have it all laid out in front of
Yeah.
you. And I would hope that every business owner listening says, you know what, let me go ask some probing questions of my technology team today, right?
Yeah.
As a
Yeah.
result of this, just to get a better understanding of what we're doing, maybe what we're not doing, and begin to put that into your plans for next quarter or next year's priority. So I
Yeah,
think that
absolutely, like start the dialogue, right? Have the conversation. Don't work in silos, right? Start the dialogue.
exactly. And it starts like if somebody didn't have a resource to go to, the way that we start that process is a 20-minute call and a questionnaire.
Yeah.
That gets them thinking about, oh, well, I don't know what my tolerance for downtime is. I don't know if we're using these unsecured cloud tools. Like
Right.
I don't know these things, and so it's a conversation starter,
Yeah.
and then an opportunity to sit down and have a deep dive that says, all right, these are the top 3 things that need to be on your mind right now based on the results of that questionnaire.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's looking to get started, that's a really easy, low cost, low whatever way to do it.
Hmm.
And sometimes it leads to folks working with us, but more often than not, it also leads to them being able to have the right dialogue internally to spawn the right projects.
Absolutely. Yeah. Completely agree. Yeah. Anything else that you want our listeners to know?
You said something earlier about prevention and being reactive. And so I'm a big believer that cybersecurity is both a preventative act, right?
Hmm.
You want to try to eliminate cyber attacks before they happen, but you have to spend as much time planning for the day when something does happen, because
Yes.
you can't insulate yourself from every single possible threat. You can't guarantee, no one can guarantee that you'll never experience a breach. So while everybody wants to focus on prevention, so they're probably, 80-20,
Yeah.
90-10 focused on prevention, I would encourage everybody to really revisit their disaster recovery plans, understand, what is going to be your incident response. Do you have insurance lined up? Do you have robust and tested backups? Do you have an attorney that you have a relationship with? So when you call them in a panic, they already know what to do when you guys have this plan. Um, so that's I think sort of the thing that everybody maybe discounts is planning for the bad
Yes.
day.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many organizations I've been part of where we've had to create a disaster recovery plan, but then it just sits there, right? So, don't just create the plan, test it, right? Make
Mhm.
sure that those that are part of that plan understand what their roles are. What are all the important numbers and who do we need to call when and if something happens? So making sure that you test it as well is just as important as creating the plan.
Yeah, and I'll throw out an interesting statistic for you. A couple years ago, Veeam, they're big in backup and data recovery. They did
Mhm.
a study that said 58% of attempted recoveries from backups failed, either because of an issue with the backup itself or a mistake or a problem during the recovery procedures. So if you don't practice it, your team doesn't know the procedures. If you
Yeah.
haven't tested it, you don't know if it's actually going to work. And I'll give you like a 30-second example. We use an online software that we aren't able to back it up directly. So we have to use third-party backup
Yeah.
service. I accidentally deleted something the other day and I went to go and restore it and the restore failed. I was like,
Oh,
why is this? And in drilling down with customer support for this third-party backup service, it come to find out that there's a constraint. Basically, they told me if you stop backing up this one field, it'll work. I said, okay, so I have to remove that field from my backup, take a new set of backups, and then I can restore forever onwards. So you're telling me that all the backups I've taken up until this point are completely useless. And they were like, yes, we're really sorry. I said, don't you, as a provider who markets that you back up this software, this financial software,
hmm,
don't you keep a running list of these types of issues so that me as a newbie, right,
yeah,
I'm in the backup business, geez, like, of course,
right.
I'm going to ask these questions and figure this stuff out, but that any other person, any normal person who comes here, that they would know they have to uncheck this field in order for the backup to be useful.
Yeah.
They were like, sorry, no, that's not what we do. Like, we don't consider that to be our job, is more or less the message that I got. And so
Oh, wow.
that's a very real example of how much responsibility sits with the owner of the data to put
Absolutely.
things in place, but then verify, right? Trust, but verify that they're usable in the way that you think and hope and expect that they are. Because a lot of times technology is complicated. You're going to
Yeah.
be surprised that it's not as straightforward as you would think. and certainly not as straightforward as the marketing on the website or
Yes,
what
yeah.
your sales rep told you. So
Absolutely. Such a great point. And I feel like we can go on for hours here. So I'm going to have you back on the show and we can dive in further. Thank you so much for being on the show. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners how they could find more information about you and eSilo.
well, thank you, Sonal. If you want to have a confidential conversation about your situation and just have me point you in the right direction, you can reach out and find me at meetcathy.com, Cathy with a C, all one word. And then I would love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn, send us a message, let us know if you like this episode, if there was something else that you had questions about. That always helps us ensure that we're delivering information that you're hoping to hear. And so a shortcut to my LinkedIn is cathymyron.com. It'll take you straight there. And it's Myron with an I, Cathy with a C. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon.
Yeah, and also just wanted to remind folks that if you are interested in having an assessment done, feel free to reach out to Minerva Consulting at let's talk at minervaconsultinginc.com. You can also go to our website at minervaconsultinginc.com. And before we leave here, I want to ask our listeners to take 3 quick next steps. One is to click that subscribe button so that you don't miss a new episode. Leave a rating and add a comment. Trust me, I do read all of those. So thank you so much for the feedback. Cathy, I really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to having you back on.
Thank you. My pleasure.